It started with silence. Not the kind that brought peace, but the kind that made your heart race in anticipation, a silence so dense it seemed to press on the skin. Yulven sat rigid in his seat within the observation dome of the Galactic Academy. Above him, the stars sprawled out like spilled dust, but today, they weren't beautiful, they were ominous. His species, the Kalari, had evolved in deep oceans where conflict had become obsolete centuries ago. His planet never knew war, never tasted blood for land or pride. That made today unbearable. The instructors had warned them, Earth's past is not like yours. It is brutal. Unfiltered, still, Yulven, like most young minds, had thought he could handle it. War, to him, had always been just a lesson, something other civilizations once experienced. But today wasn't theory. It was truth. The footage hadn't even started, but the air in the room was already suffocating. There were cadets from dozens of planets present, all representing the bright future of the galaxy. Laughter and excitement had filled the room an hour ago. But now, faces had drawn tight, bodies stiff. Yulven's gaze dropped to his trembling hands. He didn't know why they trembled. Fear? Maybe. Or something deeper, a kind of sorrow he hadn't yet learned how to process. The name, humanity, echoed in the galaxy like thunder in a canyon. Revered, feared, sometimes avoided. The Galactic Accord had strict classifications. Species like the Varn were labeled as strategists, others like the Mern as healers. But humans? They had no designation. Just a red mark. Classified. That secrecy made them even more legendary. And here he was, about to confront the reality behind the legends. "Are you all right?" a voice whispered beside him. It was Sura, a crystalline being from the Serene Cluster. Her translucent face glimmered with concern. He nodded without meeting her eyes. No one was all right. Not yet. The room dimmed. A single human historian appeared as a hologram, delivering a brief message. "This footage has not been altered. Viewer discretion is advised." And then she vanished. No introductions. No music. No slow fade-ins. Just a moment, and then humanity. The first image was a city, burned, crumbling, its skyline shattered. And then came the sound. Gunfire. Screams. Helicopters thudding low over ruined buildings. It was Earth, but not the Earth of science, art, and diplomacy that the Galactic Council referenced. This was a place of madness. Cadets gasped, some whispered prayers in their native tongues. Yulven couldn't look away. He saw a woman clutching a rifle with one arm, dragging an injured child with the other, moving between fallen walls like a ghost. He saw two soldiers pinned down under fire, one laughing while bleeding from the leg, using a flare to signal for help. He saw a group of medics, hands covered in blood, working without rest. These were not monsters. These were people trying to hold on to something. The footage cut to a human platoon marching through mud and blood, exhausted, faces smeared with ash. They looked no different from each other, young, old, black, white, tattooed, bald, male, female, but their eyes held the same weight. They weren't fighting for glory. They were surviving. A loud boom shook the audio. The room flinched as a drone exploded above a supply convoy. Fire consumed the screen. A soldier's helmet camera caught the chaos. He screamed into his comm, trying to locate his friend. "Mason? Mason?" Yulven could barely breathe. It wasn't the violence that broke him, it was the voice. The rawness. The desperation. In those few seconds, he felt something universal: loss. Fear. Love. Everything that war stripped from its victims. A few cadets stood up and walked out. Some were shaking, some quietly weeping. No one stopped them. This was a test of understanding, not endurance. No grades. No medals. Just truth. The next clip played a funeral scene. A soldier reading a letter to the family of a fallen comrade. "He wasn't just brave. He was the reason we made it through that night. He saved my life. He didn't have to, but he did. That's who he was." The cadets didn't cry because it was sad. They cried because it was real. War wasn't numbers. It was people. People who loved, who joked in trenches, who carried photographs of their children into battlefields. Yulven felt a tightness in his chest he couldn't explain. It was as if something inside him, something unshaped, had cracked. This was a level of sacrifice his species had never encountered. His people healed wounds with light, not time. But these humans, they endured scars. And still, they fought, not because they wanted to, but because surrendering meant failing those who depended on them. And yet, in the thick of all the destruction, he noticed something else. Moments. A soldier giving his last ration bar to a shivering child. A nurse playing a broken harmonica to calm her patients in a bunker. A pilot crying while flying home after losing his crew. These glimpses whispered a terrifying truth. Humanity was not driven by hatred, it was driven by hope. Yulven wiped his eyes, ashamed. He had once believed that progress meant peace. That enlightenment meant leaving pain behind. But maybe, he thought, pain was part of the path. Maybe pain, when chosen for others' sake, wasn't weakness. Maybe it was noble. He realized he hadn't blinked in over a minute. His throat was dry, his breathing uneven. The footage paused. A final image lingered, a soldier, bloodied, half-conscious, pulling a wounded enemy out of a burning structure. Enemy. Yet they saved them. Yulven had learned about equations, diplomacy, starship logistics, gravitational mechanics. None of that prepared him for this. He wasn't just witnessing history. He was being reshaped by it. The lights returned to full brightness. The instructor said nothing. There was nothing to say. The cadets were free to leave. Most did. Yulven didn't. He sat there, long after the room had emptied, as if waiting for an answer to a question he hadn't yet formed. The silence had returned. But now, it was different. Now it carried weight. Yulven didn't speak for the next 2 days. Not because he didn't want to, but because words had lost meaning. Something about what he had witnessed had hollowed out the confidence he once carried. The rest of the cadets were also subdued. Some avoided eye contact entirely. A few even left the academy, unable to reconcile the illusion of universal harmony with the raw, brutal humanity they had seen. The Galactic Council had allowed the footage for one reason: to remind them all that peace wasn't inherited. It was earned, and often paid for in blood. In the academy cafeteria, whispers floated like dust, quiet, unsure, disjointed. Most species dealt with discomfort by pretending it didn't exist. But this wasn't theoretical discomfort. It wasn't academic. It was emotional rupture. It challenged assumptions that had never been questioned. Why did humans endure so much? How could they still love after all that loss? Yulven kept asking himself that. And no instructor, no data archive, no cultural analysis offered an answer that felt honest. On the 3rd day, he requested access to Earth's historical records. Not the censored versions. The real ones. He needed to know if what he had seen was a fluke, or the norm. What he found chilled him. Wars that spanned decades. Atrocities committed in the name of God's land ideology. Civil wars. Global wars. Proxy wars. Rebellions. Revolutions. The list felt endless. But that wasn't what shook him the most. What truly broke him was how, after each collapse, humanity rebuilt. Again and again. Cities flattened by bombs were turned into centers of innovation. Generations traumatized by genocide gave birth to poets, architects, healers. No matter how many times humanity bled, it got back up. They didn't just survive. They transformed. He read testimonies of soldiers who had returned from war and started orphanages. Doctors who treated enemies as fiercely as allies. Refugees who lost everything yet built homes for others. This wasn't savagery. This was something else, something nearly impossible to describe. It wasn't just strength. It was conviction. An unwillingness to let pain define them. One entry stuck with him for days. It was from a medic during Earth's Third World conflict. She wrote, Every time I cleaned the blood off someone's skin, I remembered they were someone's child. And that made it worth it. Worth it. The idea that enduring suffering for the sake of others was somehow noble. That shook Yolven to his core. His people avoided suffering. They avoided confrontation. To them, moral superiority was defined by abstention. But to humans, it was defined by action, even when the cost was unbearable. And then came the ethics seminar. Each cadet was assigned to present a cultural value from their home planet and contrast it with another species. Yolven chose his own, Kalari harmony, versus human perseverance. He approached the podium with notes, but abandoned them after the first sentence. He didn't need them. He needed truth. He explained that the Kalari had eradicated internal conflict millennia ago through neural empathy training and biosocial regulation. They didn't lie, didn't compete violently, didn't tolerate disorder. But in achieving that balance, they had sacrificed something they hadn't realized until now: resilience. He described how he once believed that violence proved inferiority. That war was a symptom of failure. But now he wasn't so sure. Humanity didn't fight because they loved violence. They fought because they refused to abandon each other. He referenced the human saying he had found, "Leave no one behind." To his species, that was inefficient. To humans, it was sacred. When he finished, the room was silent. But not dismissive. They were listening, not just with ears, but with hearts cracked open. After the seminar, a senior instructor, a Zolari veteran who had witnessed the Ura's uprising, approached Yolven. "You've understood something most never do," he said. "Humans don't just survive war. They carry it with them. And somehow, they use it to build." Yolven nodded, though he still didn't fully understand how. But he wanted to. He began spending time with a human liaison stationed at the academy, Lieutenant Marcus J. Hale. Marcus was in his 50s, retired, and served now as a cultural advisor. He didn't wear his medals. He didn't brag. He just told stories. One evening, while sipping bitter Terran coffee, Marcus said something Yolven would never forget. "We're not proud of our wars. But we are proud of who we become because of them." That single sentence reshaped everything. War wasn't identity. It was trial. It was furnace. And the humans who survived it weren't broken, they were forged. Yolven asked Marcus why so many humans volunteered to fight, even when they didn't have to. Marcus looked out the window for a long moment before answering. "Because we believe some things are worth bleeding for. That no one else should have to. Sometimes it's as simple as that." In that moment, Yolven saw the terrifying beauty of humanity. Their capacity to bear pain for strangers. Their refusal to surrender to despair. Their absolute commitment to memory. They remembered their dead. They remembered their mistakes. And they remembered the cost of silence. He started to understand why so many species respected them, why even empires hesitated before crossing them. It wasn't because of their weapons, or their numbers, or even their science. It was because humans were bound by something more primal. They had seen the abyss, walked through it, and come back carrying others. And more importantly, they never let anyone forget what it took to get there. Yolven returned to his dorm and stared at his reflection. He was still Kalari. Still peaceful. But he no longer believed that peace meant turning away from darkness. Sometimes, peace meant standing between danger and the ones who couldn't stand for themselves. He knew now why the footage had been shown. It wasn't to shock them. It wasn't punishment. It was a gift. A reminder. Peace is not the absence of war. It is the presence of those willing to fight for others, without ever losing their humanity. The Academy implemented new protocols following the psychological impact the footage had on cadets. Counseling sessions were offered, though many species chose silence over confrontation with what they felt. But for some, silence was no longer an option. The footage had opened a question too loud to ignore. Why were humans not only capable of surviving war but walking away from it with their souls intact? Or sometimes, more intact than before? Surintal, a Zarnan cadet, raised this very question during a cross-cultural analysis class. Why didn't war reduce humans to primal animals? Why didn't repeated trauma turn their species nihilistic? Instead, humans built monuments, wrote music, created charities in honor of fallen comrades. Instead of rejecting the past, they honored it. The instructors didn't have a single answer. But they assigned every cadet to a project, to choose a moment in human history and explain not how humanity survived it, but how they recovered from it. The human concept of healing wasn't just biological. It was spiritual, communal, and active. The cadets quickly found themselves buried in archives filled with aftermaths, not just battle reports, but rebuilding efforts. Veterans returning to plant trees where bombs had fallen. Children of wartime orphans forming reconciliation groups decades after hostilities ended. Every story seemed to resist the galactic stereotype that war hollowed out a species. Humanity, it seemed, was proof that the fire could also refine. One cadet, a veterani named Ikash, focused on the Battle of Verdun. Not the tactical side, but the letters soldiers had written from the trenches. They didn't speak of conquest. They spoke of longing, of brothers, of rain and mud and the unbearable need to return home. The human soldier wasn't merely a weapon. He was a human being, fully aware of his fear, his hopes, and still marching forward. Ikash later wrote that Verdun didn't teach him about strategy. It taught him about love in a place where love shouldn't survive. That became the unexpected theme in their findings. Love. Not romantic, but resolute. A love of family, of home, of ideals. Even when those ideals had failed them, humans kept trying to reach for something better. They didn't give up. When treaties broke, they still made new ones. When leaders failed, they still voted. When the world burned, they still sang. That, more than any military victory, marked them as unique in the eyes of the other species. Lieutenant Marcus Hale was invited to lecture on the phenomenon of post-war unity. He explained how, after the Earth's Second World War, nations once at odds formed alliances. Enemies became economic partners. Formerly isolated countries joined global organizations. Out of ash, cooperation was forged. Not out of naive hope, but out of learned cost. Marcus didn't glorify it. He was careful to say that the unity didn't erase the pain or undo the dead. But it did honor them. And that mattered. He shared a story of a war memorial where visitors left shoes for children killed during the Holocaust. No orders, no rules, just a silent, grassroots act of remembrance. That act, he said, was what separated humanity from destruction. They didn't let grief fade. They gave it shape. And through that, others found meaning. Some species found this confusing. They saw the human need to preserve memory as an unnecessary wound, a reopening of trauma. But humans insisted that memory was not a weakness, it was responsibility. Their past was full of horrors, yes, but they refused to erase it. They documented everything, the good, the evil, the shameful. Not to wallow in it, but to teach those who came after. Yul then observed how deeply integrated this was in every aspect of human culture. Their art, their language, even their architecture. Memorial walls. Statues of the fallen. Books filled with names. And everywhere, one theme repeated, lest we forget. It was not just sentiment. It was warning. A society that forgot its scars was doomed to tear itself open again. Humanity had learned that through the hard way, and then chosen to carry the burden, so others might not. The cadets began to realize something none of their instructors had ever said outright. The footage had not just been a lesson in what war looked like. It was a doorway into understanding why the galaxy feared humans, yet relied on them during crises. Not for their strength, but their capacity to keep going when everything else fell apart. A month after the footage, the Academy invited representatives from planets that had been aided by Earth during galactic disasters. Refugees from the Breck massacre, survivors of the Zeltor virus, engineers saved during the Telluri quakes. One by one, they told stories, not of battle, but of arrival. How human ships landed when no others did. How human doctors stayed when others fled. How human volunteers built shelters, carried children, buried the dead, and returned years later to see how the communities were doing. They didn't come for glory, They came because someone had to. A quiet understanding began to grow among the cadets. Perhaps humanity's greatest achievement was not winning wars, but how they behaved after them. How they didn't allow themselves to forget the weight of violence. How they poured energy into ensuring others didn't experience the same. When asked why their kind helped so many others, one human aid worker replied, "Because we know what it feels like to be alone in the fire." And that was the core. Humans carried a collective memory not just of their own suffering, but of the suffering of others. They empathized fiercely, even dangerously. That empathy made them formidable in ways no strategy ever could. They didn't just fight for themselves. They fought for strangers, for allies, for enemies. And once they committed, they did not abandon. Even centuries after Earth's wars had ended, that spirit had not left them. Their diplomats quoted soldiers. Their physicians wore tags that once belonged to battlefield medics. Their rescue crews honored traditions started in trenches. In every generation, they passed down not only stories, but values. And those values weren't sterile. They were forged in the ugliest places imaginable, and somehow emerged beautiful. That realization, more than any lecture or statistic, shook the Academy. Because for the first time, they understood what it meant to be human. Not to be violent. Not to be emotional. But to be willing. Willing to endure pain if it meant saving one more life. Willing to carry the weight so others could walk free. No species had ever truly captured that in words. But the cadets knew it now. And they would never see humans the same again. For weeks after the lecture and exposure to human war history, discussions across the Academy shifted in tone. The aliens who had once approached humanity with clinical curiosity now spoke with quiet caution and, in many cases, profound respect. But among all the species, there remained a question that no database or interview could answer. If humans experienced war with such gravity and carried its emotional residue so openly, why did they continue to take part in conflicts? What was the driving force behind a species so traumatized yet so consistent in answering the call when others hesitated? To find the answer, the Academy arranged deeper socio-cultural immersion. The cadets were assigned human mentors, former soldiers, historians, and peacekeepers, people who had lived through Earth's many phases of violence and recovery. These mentors did not glorify their past. They were painfully honest about their mistakes, about the failures in diplomacy, and about the cost that came with every late decision. But what caught the cadets off guard was that the humans didn't speak of war as an identity. They spoke of duty. Duty, in the human sense, was not abstract or procedural. It was visceral. It meant standing when others ran. It meant accepting that pain was inevitable but abandoning others was not. Human soldiers didn't fight because they loved battle. They fought because someone had to protect the fragile pieces of the world still worth saving. That concept, that one could be both broken by war and still willingly walk into it again for the sake of others, challenged everything the cadets thought they understood. A group of Terran veterans explained a particularly human phenomenon, the return. After wars ended, many would re-enlist, not out of a hunger for violence, but because they couldn't leave others behind. Soldiers became aid workers. Commanders turned diplomats. A retired combat medic shared how, in his civilian years, he joined humanitarian missions on worlds affected by famine and war, often initiated by political disputes he'd once fought to resolve. "If you can stop pain, you should," he told his assigned cadet. "Even if it wasn't your fault. Even if it wasn't your fight. Especially then." The more the cadets listened, the more they saw the paradox. Humans could wield unimaginable power, yet chose compassion more often than not. Their history was filled with retaliation, yes, but also reconciliation. They knew how to destroy, but they consistently chose to rebuild. Their wars were not mindless aggression but responses to real threats, tyranny, genocide, extinction events. And where many would crumble under those pressures, humans adapted. They bled, mourned, then stood back up and asked, "Who still needs help?" No other species had cultural doctrines as complex or emotionally layered. The Terran ethos wasn't just military, it was moral. Concepts like Just war, collateral grief, and post-trauma stewardship had no equivalents in alien dictionaries. Yet these ideas were central to how humanity viewed conflict and peace alike. They believed not only in surviving war but in emerging from it with the capacity to help others who hadn't. Pain, to them, was never the end of the story. This mindset bled into their military structure. Even in wartime, medics operated under symbols respected by enemy forces. Units carried emergency rations for civilians. And every command hierarchy included ethical officers, soldiers trained not only to kill but to think about what came after. When the cadets learned that Earth's forces embedded counselors within combat units to address trauma in real time, they were stunned. Humans didn't just treat the wounds, they anticipated them. It wasn't long before the cadets were given case files, not of battles, but of rescues. One file detailed an orbital skirmish near a fringe colony that ended with human soldiers evacuating not only their allies but also enemy wounded. When asked why they risked resources to save former combatants, the reply was simple. Because we could. In that statement was the core of what the cadets had slowly begun to understand. Humanity didn't fight because they loved war. They fought because they loved peace, and peace required sacrifice. A visiting diplomat from a world once ravaged by interstellar slavery gave testimony to Earth's intervention. Her people were at the brink of cultural extinction. The galaxy had turned away. But Earth had intervened. Not for profit. Not for territory. But because they believed no species deserved silence in their suffering. The humans had arrived with food, medicine, translators, and, when necessary, armed forces. They stayed until the planet could stand on its own. And then they left. No occupation. No demands. Just a silent promise fulfilled. This was not exceptional behavior. This was policy. Cadets who once believed humans were anomalies began to reconsider. Perhaps they weren't outliers. Perhaps they were what happened when a species learned from its darkest moments and refused to repeat them without reflection. Perhaps, despite all appearances, humans were among the most emotionally advanced civilizations in the galaxy. The cadets started sharing their observations in their own academies. Reports were filed back to homeworlds. Advisors requested more Terran case studies. But more than that, the aliens who once feared human brutality began requesting to learn human ethics. They no longer wanted to just understand how humans fought, but why they chose to. This subtle shift created a ripple in diplomatic circles. When war did break out in another quadrant of the galaxy months later, several non-human factions requested joint operations with human peacekeepers. They didn't need Earth's firepower, they needed Earth's restraint. They wanted someone in the room who understood what it meant to choose a path other than destruction, even when destruction was easier. And for the cadets who had sat through the original footage, the transformation was complete. What began as horror had become perspective. They didn't admire humans for their weapons or their victories. They admired them for their ability to remain human in the face of horror. And perhaps that was what the galaxy needed most. Not more firepower, but more of what made Earth survive itself. An unflinching heart, and the strength to carry others through the fire. The true shift came quietly. After all the lectures, analysis, and first-hand accounts, what resonated most with the alien cadets wasn't the spectacle of human war, it was the silence that followed it. The stories of what humans did after the last shots were fired. The rebuilding. The apologies. The memorials not just for their own, but for everyone lost. The deliberate effort to make meaning out of suffering, to create peace from ruins, to prevent others from walking down the same road. It was not an instinct they understood at first, but one they began to respect deeply. Many cadets who had once viewed humans with wariness now looked to them with something closer to awe. They weren't worshipping strength, but a particular kind of endurance. A capacity to process horror without being consumed by it. Humans didn't pretend war was noble. They didn't sanitize its consequences. They carried every scar into every future decision. Their veterans spoke not of glory, but of weight. Their leaders didn't celebrate victories, they mourned the necessity of them. And in that restraint lay an unspoken code, one that felt uniquely human. One cadet, having spent weeks among human diplomats, put it plainly in his report. They grieve as a strategy. It was not weakness. It was preparation. The deep emotional memory of war made them act quickly to avoid its repetition. They could recognize the signs of escalation before it became disaster. Because they had lived it. Not once. Repeatedly. And rather than forget, they chose remembrance as a shield. No propaganda. No erasure. Just a quiet commitment to never become monsters in the name of survival. It was this mentality that drew interest from non-human species who had traditionally held themselves above emotional response. Cold logic had led to centuries of missteps, including conflicts that might have been prevented if empathy had been allowed a seat at the table. And now they saw what a species with emotional intelligence, scarred, volatile, unpredictable, but deeply human, could accomplish. Humans weren't reckless. They were just driven by stakes other species hadn't yet dared to consider personal. They viewed every child as worth protecting. Every elder as a link to history. Every stranger as someone who could be saved. And they acted on that belief not out of protocol, but principle. Not because it was efficient, but because it was right. This difference was never clearer than in humanitarian operations led by Earth. They sent aid before being asked. They landed ships on planets no other force dared to approach. And when asked why, the answer was always the same. Because we remember what it's like to have no one come. Alien strategists studying humanity's long-term behavior were astonished to find patterns of sacrificial deployment. Earth had often committed forces not to defend allies or gain resources, but simply to stop suffering. To halt genocides, crush slave empires, and dismantle networks that profited off helplessness. They didn't benefit materially from many of these actions. In fact, they often lost soldiers, spent vast amounts of resources, and gained little recognition. But they did it anyway. That kind of moral economy had no precedent in galactic policy. What the cadets learned next shook them even further. Humanity's dead were never left behind. Earth's retrieval teams were known to cross enemy lines, land on unstable surfaces, and even postpone attacks to recover remains. Not just for the living, but for those already gone. It wasn't just about morale. It was about dignity. They refused to let death become impersonal. They refused to allow war to make the lost invisible. This behavior confused alien cultures that treated fallen soldiers as statistics. To humans, each one was a life story, cut short but never forgotten. The most sobering lesson came in the form of Earth's post-war projects. It was discovered that humans often funded recovery efforts for enemy worlds. This went beyond reparations. It was part of their doctrine. Rehumanization, as it was termed. The belief that even former enemies deserved a second chance. Not out of naivety, but because they believed that cycles of hate only ended when someone chose to stop returning the blow. This approach baffled species that operated under strict justice codes or generational vengeance. Yet it worked. Peace held longer. Rebellions faded faster. Entire civilizations changed course because humans refused to let enmity be eternal. Alien psychologists were stunned by the emotional spectrum within the human military. Soldiers who could carry out devastating missions still cried over civilian casualties. Officers who planned war strategies also wrote letters to the families of the fallen. There was no attempt to detach. Instead, there was accountability, a rare currency in the galaxy. Humans didn't hide from their decisions. They lived with them. And that willingness to carry consequence gave their presence a gravity that no other species could replicate. What followed was an unexpected consequence. Military academies across multiple worlds began to restructure. Emotional training modules were introduced. Ethics councils were made standard in campaign planning. Entire departments were created to study Terran conflict psychology. Humans became not just soldiers to emulate, but moral architects of a new kind of galactic conduct. They had shown what warfare looked like when tempered with conscience. And more importantly, they had proven it wasn't a weakness, it was survival with soul. In the final evaluation conference, the cadets were asked one question: had their perception of humanity changed? The responses were unanimous. Humanity was no longer viewed as unstable or dangerous. They were seen as vital. Not just because of their strength, but because of their balance. A species that understood both chaos and order. That could deploy horror, and still seek healing. That didn't run from emotion, but wielded it like a tool. And who, in the end, offered the galaxy not dominance, but hope. It was then that the emotional core of humanity became clear. The humans who bore the weight of their past were also the ones most willing to fight for someone else's future. They knew loss intimately. Which is why they fought so hard to prevent it. They didn't want statues. They didn't seek admiration. They wanted a galaxy where fewer children learned to count by the number of air raid sirens. Where fewer families searched trouble for names. Where peace wasn't just a theory, but a daily choice. This was the emotional ending that left cadets silent, not from fear, but from realization. Humanity didn't survive because it was brutal. It survived because it cared even when it hurt. Even when it lost. Even when the galaxy looked away. And in a universe filled with cold calculation, that kind of fire, flawed, human, relentless, might be the one thing capable of saving them all.